All right, hello and welcome to the Yet Another Value podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Walker, and with me today, I'm excited to have my friend, Joe Boskovich. Joe is a partner at Old West Investment. Joe, how's it going?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on. I told you earlier that I've listened to several of your podcasts, and you have a lot of great guests and impressive stock pitches. So yeah, I hope I don't disappoint. But
Hey,
for having me on.
look, thank you for that, but let me start the podcast. Instead of you pitching me, let me start the way I start everything, and that's by pitching you. We've chatted off and on for probably a year and a half or 2 years, and I was telling you before the pod started, I think one of my favorite things about you is you and I started chatting about some of the IDT spinoffs, which I think are a major portion of y'all's holdings. But at Old West, I think the three major themes are IDT spinoffs, a Canadian entertainment company, and then uranium company. And like the three things, like they're all completely different, and just kind of the intellectual flexibility to be able to look at and value these things with completely different valuation processes, completely different theses. Most people are kind of like me and they say, hey, I like cable companies, and maybe I step a little bit out and I look at the content companies, but you guys are just in three wildly different sectors. And I really like that flexibility. And obviously the returns have been there too. So anything you want to say about that, or should we just dive into WildBrain?
No, yeah. So it's right. It does seem maybe like we own a hodgepodge of different businesses, but I would just say, the commonality with that, and we talk about one of the most important parts of our investment process being investing with owner managers and people that we think are good capital allocators and have more to gain or lose through their ownership than they do through their compensation. So I would say that would be the underlying theme across all of those holdings. And so if you look at it through the lens of smart capital allocation and people that are aligned with shareholders, then maybe it's not so much of a hodgepodge. But yeah, definitely if you look at it from a sector standpoint.
Let me ask you a question, because you and I, again, we met talking about one of the IDT spinoffs. That's Howard Jonas's company. And I think Howard Jonas, among value investors, he's got a long reputation. He's done a lot of spinoffs. Straight Path was obviously the headliner here. But, one thing I've thought a lot about Howard Jonas is it's almost John Malone-like to the extreme, where John Malone, every deal he does, you do well, but he does better. And with Howard Jonas, one of the issues I've had is, he pays himself really well. And I think it all works out really well for shareholders. But, I think back to an 8K IDT filed in January. They're looking at spinning off, I think it's Net2Phone, one of their subsidiaries. And they gave Howard 5% of Net2Phone before they spun it off, right? Like they just gave it to him. And yeah, this spinoff probably creates a lot of value, and they built a lot of value there. But at the same time, I look at that, I'm like, man, it feels like heads he wins, tails he wins a lot. Do you feel like that, or how do you kind of look at that?
Yeah, I guess I saw that filing too, on Net2Phone, and I guess all I could say is I think when they spin it off, and I think valuations today are totally wacky, but if you were to compare an asset like Net2Phone to Ring Central,
Yeah.
or by 8, I mean, it's just that is worth, multiples of the entire IDT, market cap. So, look, I think you will do very well. We've been invested in a lot of the entities, and when he does offerings, it's typically done through a rights offering, or, he typically tries to include the larger shareholders. So I'm not going to disagree. I'm not going to sit there and say 100% of the time, he's aligned with shareholders, but I think, more often than not. And, we as shareholders, right, obviously also have the ability to sell a spin or buy more of a spin on the open market. So, we do own all the spins, but different weightings. So, once an asset is spun, we don't necessarily treat it as just an IDT spinoff. We try to analyze it from a company's perspective. And guess what? That's why a name like Raphael Holdings is a very large portfolio weighting, and certain other names like IDT are smaller positions. I like IDT. One thing that I've noticed over the years is, and I've been wrong now because the stock's done so well, but it seems like oftentimes a lot of the spins don't get a lot of credit from the public markets until after they're spun. So, yeah, look, I don't think he enriches himself or he's as self-dealing as a lot of the other, I guess, spin-off masters. And I've gotten to know him fairly well, and we've enjoyed being a shareholder. I've said this before. I think his greatest successes are ahead of him.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty pumped on Howard Jonas companies.
Well, Raphael is not the subject, but of this podcast, but my limited understanding of the science there is that the potential there is pretty enormous, and it's not just on the financial side, but if that succeeds, I think just for all of humanity, I think it's going to be pretty enormous. But that's not the topic for today. The topic for the day is actually a Canadian company. It's on the smaller cap side, but the company is WildBrain. So I'll just turn it over to you. What is WildBrain, and why are you guys so interested in it?
Yeah, so WildBrain is a children's content and brands company. They're actually the largest owner of kids' TV shows outside of the major Hollywood studios. So I think that gives it a huge advantage in terms of its scale and size. But so what does the company do? They make children's cartoons, and then they distribute those cartoons across the various linear broadcast platforms, streaming platforms, and on their advertising video on demand network, WildBrain Spark. And then for a second income stream, they license all the consumer products based on their programs. I think one of the great competitive advantages or characteristics of this business is that it's a vertically integrated business, meaning that they control the entire supply chain. And I think that's really important to understand from the get-go. So, as I mentioned, they own a lot of their IP. And in a lot of cases where they don't own the IP, such as the case with Sonic, which we could talk about recently, they just announced a deal. Because of their vertically integrated structure, they are able to negotiate certain rights where even though they're not the copyright holder, they essentially capture the same economics as if they did own that IP. From a distribution standpoint, they're the captain of their own ship, where if they want to and if they choose to, they could control that distribution either through their AVOD network, WildBrain Spark, which we could talk about that more in a bit, but huge eyeballs and watch time, and just some of the metrics that they show are incredible. One of the great things about it, so WildBrain Spark, but then they also own 4 Canadian linear broadcast channels, so they could distribute their content on those channels as well. And I think that's really important because they're not beholden to some offer or deal from some other service where maybe they don't like the economics. They could go and grow a brand on their AVOD network, which they have done with several brands, and it's been successful, and we could talk more about that too. And then I would say lastly, they control their own destiny from a consumer products licensing standpoint through their licensing agency, WildBrain CPLG, where they represent their brands and about 400 different partner brands. Look, I think there's 3 qualitative factors that are very important that make this a really, really compelling investment in my opinion. So one would be a strong management team, and we've talked about this before, but really the cornerstone of our process is investing in management teams that we think are great and allocate capital efficiently and are aligned with us as shareholders. And that's definitely the case with WildBrain. And then I also think, one of the catalysts for unlocking value is oftentimes a new management team. And that's also the case with WildBrain. In 2019, they named a new CEO, Eric Ellenbogen. Eric Ellenbogen has a storied career in creating kids content and developing great franchises. He was the CEO at Marvel in the early 2000s before it was sold to Disney. Then he co-founded a company called Classic Media, which became one of the largest owners of branded kids content. They owned brands like Rocky and Bullwinkle, Lassie. In 2012, He sold Classic Media to DreamWorks Animation, where he became an executive at DreamWorks Animation. He was the head of DreamWorks Classics and the head of DreamWorks International Television. And then, as we all know, he sold DreamWorks Animation to NBC Universal, where he became an executive at NBC Universal and actually started up Classic Media as a division again under NBC Universal. And he joined the board of WildBrain as an advisor in the middle of 2018. And as I said, in August of 2019, he was named CEO. One of the first things he did as CEO was change the name of the company from DHX Media to WildBrain, which was the name of its AVOD asset. He renamed the AVOD asset WildBrain Spark. And really for the last 4 or 5 quarters, he's been putting the right management team in place, putting some of the right deals in place. And I think really readying the company to emerge as a dominant force in children's media. And, so that would be one. Two, and you should look for this with any business. And I've heard you talk about it before, but what is their competitive moat, right? And I think with a brands company, particularly in children's, but in all media, I think that competitive moat is often served up as great IP or a great franchise. And, I would at least suggest, and it's one of the things that I've learned in different media investments is the only way to truly know that you have because a lot of small media companies particularly, they talk about their IP and we have this great portfolio of IP, we have these great franchises. But like I said, I would suggest that the only proof that you have great IP or the only proof that you really have a great franchise, it should be borne out in high margin consumer product sales. And I would say if you don't have that, either you don't have a great franchise, maybe you're building a great franchise, but I would equate that more to speculation than investing because you never know what's going to resonate with an audience. You never know what's going to be big. As you know, some of the silliest ideas become the biggest successes, and a lot of things that you think are slam dunks flop. And then maybe management just hasn't done a good job at building the IP. And I think that's also definitely the case with WildBrain's past management. They lack the expertise to kind of push certain IP through the whole process of brand extension. And that's why I'm excited about some of the other portfolio properties outside of the Peanuts franchise. But, as a good example, the example I always use is Disney's Pixar's car franchise, right? So one of the most successful franchises of the last 20 years. But if you look at it from a pure content production standpoint, it's been successful, obviously, from a revenue standpoint, but it hasn't made the company a lot of money. I think Cars 1, Disney made about $100 million, and they lost money on Cars 2. And that's because of the huge production content costs, huge advertising and marketing spend promoting the project. So like I said, very underwhelming from a theatrical production standpoint. But Cars, from the sale of lunch boxes and health and beauty aids and food products and bed sheets and so on, has made Disney north of $20 billion. So, what is WildBrain's great franchise? And I believe it is the Peanuts franchise. Now you could think whatever you want about the Peanuts franchise. The content's kind of old and stodgy. Until recently, there has been no new content made for that franchise in decades. But it is a fact that Peanuts and Snoopy is the number 8 character brand in the world if you look at global retail sales. The Peanuts franchise does $1.6 billion a year in global retail sales. And I think what's even more impressive is the fact that there's been no new content made in decades. Just imagine the power if they turn the franchise around. And we could talk in a little bit about the new Apple TV content deal, but it's going to be huge. And I feel fairly confident that it's going to make Peanuts one of the top kids brands of today's generations. So, that would be one. Like I said, great franchise, should be tied to great consumer product sales. And what's interesting is if you look at WildBrain, they bought the Peanuts franchise in 2017. In 2017, if you looked at WildBrain's financials, I want to say maybe it was like 7 or 8% of total revenue was tied to consumer products, where today it's like 45%. So just an example of how, great franchise brings consumer product sales, and that's really changes everything. And then lastly, and to me, the most exciting part of this investment, and I think this makes a good investment, a potential great investment, and a home run investment would be if you could identify a breakout business within the larger business. And in WildBrain's case, it's their AVOD asset, WildBrain Spark, which, as you've had this shift of eyeballs away from, linear television to nonlinear television, in the kids space particularly, YouTube's really been leading that charge. And I think they grab like 20% of all kids views. And WildBrain Spark is either the first or second largest network of content on YouTube. And if you look at the watch time and the numbers, it's crazy. It's like 4 billion views per month. They claim that 1 out of 3 kids globally watch content on the WildBrain Spark network. Long runway for growth. And if you looked at this past quarter, which was announced last week, revenue for Spark grew 70% sequentially over the last quarter. And what is a digital media asset growing at 30, 40, 50% year over year with great network effect properties? What is that worth? It's definitely not worth the 9 times EV to EBITDA multiple that you have for the bigger brands company today. I think today's multiples are wacky, but the market today is values an asset like that, a digital media asset that's EBITDA positive, at a multiple of revenue. And if you were to apply that same revenue to just Spark, and I'm not claiming that's the right multiple, I think, like I said, things are wacky. You can make an argument that today just Spark's worth the entire market cap. So, to wrap it up, and then we'll go into discussion, but yeah, this new management team, they're just getting started. They're transforming and turning around this company. You've started to see investor sentiment really change on this name. A lot of the analysts in Canada have been scarred by the former DHX media. And, one of the things that we look for investments are situations where the return is very asymmetric, right? Where we handicap the downside, but if executed properly, and we could talk about why I think management will execute properly and why they've already started to execute properly. If they do that, this could be a complete home run. And, so if you look at the market cap today is about 450 million. They have about 450 million in net debt, so an enterprise value of 900 million. Well, on the downside, I would argue that just the Peanuts franchise is worth the entire enterprise value. And you could draw that conclusion in a number of ways, but just if you look at comps, last year Hasbro brought Entertainment One largely for the Peppa Pig franchise, and they paid $4 billion for that asset, which would suggest that WildBrain stake in Peanuts is, like I said, somewhere worth the current enterprise value. And I think it'll be a lot more as Apple continues to change this brand and make it one of the top kids brands in the world. And so that's from a downside perspective. I think the Peanuts franchise is worth the enterprise value. Now, from the upside perspective, you take the Peanuts franchise and what they're doing with Apple TV, plus other library content, which I'm excited about and we could talk about, plus consumer product sales, which isn't even baked into any of these estimates, plus the advertising opportunity at WildBrain Spark, the AVOD network, plus the ability for the AVOD network to discover new IP, discover tomorrow's hits, and then partner with that IP. I just think, all of those 5 buckets together equals, lots of ways for WildBrain to win, WildBrain to win big. One thing Eric Ellenbogen said when he first came to the company is he said, I believe at WildBrain, we will have several of the next big hits in children's content. What are the chances that we create that next big hit? he said, we won't. We're not even going to try. And I think, like I said, you have a lot of great ideas out there that never come to fruition, and a lot of silly ideas that do. But with their ability with WildBrain Spark, and they've invested a lot of money into ad tech and understanding, audience viewing patterns. But their ability to say, hey, this piece of IP is really popular amongst 12-year-old girls in France. Let's take this content, put it on our AVOD network where we have 200 million subscribers. We already represent 650 different kids brands and have huge engagement. We'll put it on our WildBrain Hub channels and see how it does, and maybe take it to other territories. But their ability to do that, and then to partner with that IP and maybe have some sort of economic stake in the IP or in consumer product sales. Yeah, I think it's a great blueprint to make this just a phenomenal long-term investment.
Perfect. Well, hey, that was a great overview. But one of my favorite things about this podcast is I've known this was DHX Media for a long time, and I've known the story for a long time. I remember Deborah Fine pitching it at 2017 at Irisone. And as you said, like a lot of Canadian analysts, I think I had that mental block that this thing is a time suck. This thing is a suck. The new CEO came in 2019. One of my favorite things is when I was refreshing for this, I was surprised by how positive I was on a lot of, especially with the Q2 numbers, a lot of the financial turnarounds and stuff. So I was very surprised with how well the turnaround seems to be going. But let me play some devil's advocate on a couple of the points that you made here, right?
Yep.
So I think the first point you made is the downside protection is in the brands, right? So when we're talking brands, I think their big brands they have, is it Kalu?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say in the brands, in the Peanuts franchise.
Yeah, so Peanuts franchise is the big one, right? So the Peanuts franchise is the big one. They bought that from Iconics in 2017. I think they got an 80% stake for $345 million. And I think Strawberry Shortcake was included in that as well, right? So I think the first thing that people would come out and say, hey, okay, I get Peanuts has value, right? But all these brands that they've got, Peanuts have been passed around. Iconics bought it for $175 million in 2010. Then DHX bought it in 2017. Strawberry Shortcake passed around. Teletubbies, I think they bought it for like less than $30 million in 2013. So I think the first pushback would be, hey, if a major media company really wanted one of these brands, they could have had one of these brands in the past. So why are these brands kind of, obviously the Snoopy TV show on Apple is maybe a little bit of a game changer for Peanuts, but why are these kind of passed over brands that might be a little bit also runs? Why are they worth so much more now than they were when they were kind of getting transacted a couple of years ago?
Yeah, so I guess to start, we should probably start at the beginning because I think it'll give better context for the
go ahead.
of this discussion. But so it was 2006, maybe 2007. There were two Canadian media companies that merged. It was Decode, I think that's how you pronounce it, Decode Entertainment and Halifax Film Company. That's how you get the DHX. And I think that the concept behind what they were trying to do in concept seemed great, right? So really what they did is over the next 10 years, they rolled up, 6 or 7 different children's brands because it was kind of a fragmented industry. And the big players in the business, like a Disney, they're not necessarily buying brands. They're creating their own franchises. And, if you read Bob Iger's book, one of the big changes that he brought to Disney was to get away from releasing new feature films, but, concentrate on the current franchises that they have. And, that's what Disney's been largely focused on for a long time. So they're not out there, rolling up old IP and trying to reinvent it. So I think in concept, past management, it was a great idea. The problem is they lacked execution and really didn't have the expertise to push those brands through every stage of brand extension, right? So, the production, the distribution, and then most importantly, the consumer products, which is the really high margin business. So like you, the first time I ever heard of DHX Media was in 2015 when Deborah Fine pitched it at the SON conference. And, earlier I told you how we look for great management teams. One of the things that one of the primary, and we could source an idea through, a million different ways. Like just, for example, every name I've ever heard pitched on your podcast, I've spent a little bit of time looking at, because that's a smart way to source names. But one of the primary ways that we would source new ideas is we go through every SEC Form 4 filing from the day before. So simply, if we see an insider write a check for $3-4 million buying stock in their own company with their after-tax capital, it doesn't mean we're going to go buy it, but maybe this is interesting. So maybe this is a rock that you kind of overturn. And then, so another thing that we do is we kind of call it our 13F screen or scan, but that would be we've just developed a network of people that I think are smart, people that I know they're very thoughtful in the way they think about names. Like I said, like you, Andrew, right? I know you're thoughtful in the way you think about names. So is it not worth, a couple hours of my time to when you mention something, to just see if we think there's anything there and try to kind of fit it within the lens of our investment process? I think that's a no-brainer. So
I think people think ideas need to be original, but I do think it's like, hey, if somebody you think is sharp lays it out on a platter for you, like, you don't have to take their word for it, but if they give you the thesis, why not just go investigate it for 10 seconds or something and do a little work and get a little smarter on it?
Yeah, 100%. Now, ultimately, as you would agree, it needs to be your own idea, because when it doesn't work out, I can't see it. Well, Andrew was wrong. Like, that can't be my postpartum analysis. But you got to make it your own idea. But anyway, so one of those managers that we've developed a great respect for over time is Fine Capital. And Deborah Tisch, she used to run Deborah Fine used to run money for the Tisch family for their single family office and started Fine Capital. And more recently, her partner Jonathan Witcher has taken over as the chief investment officer of the company, and I think he's a very sharp guy. He's joined the board at WildBrain. But anyway, so go back to 15. They pitched it at the Sohn conference. I thought it was pretty interesting, caused me to look more into it. And at the time, their kind of flagship brand was Teletubbies, and it was just hard for me to wrap my mind around Teletubbies being an evergreen property. And a lot of that was personal bias. I have young kids. I just remember the Teletubbies coming on and just not really understanding how this is some grand slam brand that has Mickey Mouse characteristics. Now with that said, if you go back to the early 2000s and part of Eric Ellenbogen's mission or what he's talked about doing at the new WildBrain is dumpster diving in this portfolio of IP that they have and finding the brands that they could kind of reinvent. So to get back to that, with Teletubbies, so you could think Teletubbies is not a good property or whatever, but if you go back to the early 2000s, Teletubbies was doing like $200-300 million a year in consumer product sales. Yep. So regardless of what you think, that's a franchise that cranks out that sort of consumer products. And but it wasn't doing it then, right? It was an old brand. And by the way, a lot of it was past management's fault, because when they bought it, it was a brand that was doing, a lot more in terms of consumer products, and kind of got ignored and just reintroduced to the market in the wrong way. And consumer products were, rolled out too quickly. So, it kind of lost a little bit of, I guess, its secret sauce. But anyways, I just had trouble wrapping my mind around owning a company where the investment thesis was Teletubbies. So, we kind of passed, but kept a close eye on it. And, it's interesting. Fine Capital, kind of periodically continued to increase their stake in the company. I forget what the exact ownership stake was at that point, but they had a sizable stake. And then in 2017 is when they announced the acquisition of Peanuts from Iconics Brands. When they did that, I didn't really know how to think about that. I hadn't done a lot of work on Peanuts at that point. I had no idea that it did $1.6 billion in consumer product sales. I couldn't have told you that. Once again, all I know from my experience is my grandma loves Snoopy. My parents think Snoopy's great. But I was never a big Snoopy fan. But if you think about when we were young, when we were growing up, at that time, it was starting to become a dated brand, right? The animation seemed old to our generation. And there had been no new content rolled out in decades.
Yep.
Wild or DHX Media at that time, I think that, they paid roughly 12 times EBITDA for that brand. I didn't know how to, was that a lot for that brand? Was that a little for that brand? I just didn't really know how to visualize that contextually. The stock got beat up pretty bad after that from the Canadian analyst community because they were already levered, and they levered up even more so to buy that piece of IP. And then I think, where I changed and really started to dig in was probably about a year later. If you recall, when they bought Iconics Brands Entertainment Division, they bought the 80% stake in the Peanuts franchise because the Schultz only owned 20%. And then they bought with it 100% stake in the Strawberry Shortcake franchise. So a year later, they announced that they were selling half of their stake in the Peanuts franchise to Sony. And I don't remember the exact, dollar amounts, but what did you tell me earlier that they bought you mentioned it earlier. You said they bought.
They bought the 80% stake for $345. I can't remember exactly what they did.
Okay. So right. So they bought like this 80% stake for $345. And I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but a year later, they announced they were selling half of their 80% stake, not even half of their 80% stake, 39% of their 80% stake. So they still have majority control. But they sold that to Sony, and I don't remember the exact number, but they sold it to Sony for something like 230 or 40 million. So effectively 1 year later, they sold half of that stake to Peanuts to Sony. So their return on that investment was something like 30 or 40%, whatever it was, in that 1 year time period. And it didn't include any of Strawberry Shortcake.
Yep.
So I kind of sat there at that point and I go, okay, well, this is interesting, right? So clearly, based on the Sony acquisition, and maybe Sony could have overpaid, but Sony's a giant in the media space. So clearly based on that acquisition, Sony that helped me kind of visualize the original purchase price a little bit more. So, okay, maybe they didn't overpurchase. Maybe they got a pretty good deal. Sony thinks they got a good deal, and they still have their 100% stake in Strawberry Shortcake. So that's really, I want to say right around there. So that's 2018. That's when we kind of took our initial stake in WildBrain, and, continue to build it over time. After that, Find Capital continued to increase their stake. Then Eric Ellenbogen joined as an advisor. Then he became CEO. Well, if you look at it today, Find Capital, I think they own close to 50% of the company. Jonathan Witcher's on the board. You have this new management team. And then I think where we kind of rounded out our position and it became a core position was after they announced this deal with Apple TV for the Peanuts franchise, which I think is going to be huge. They've already started to roll out new content, but I think it's become pretty clear that Peanuts is no longer going to be, a brand that seemed old and stodgy to our generation and to my younger kids' generation, to your kids' generation. It's going to be a cool brand. And, just a couple of their original shows I've watched with my 7-year-old son, and he's into it. They had a show we could talk about a little bit later, but it's called Snoopy in Space. And, he was telling me one day from school, he came home from school and this was like in kindergarten, but, they were learning about astronomy and the planets, and the teacher put on an episode of Snoopy in Space because it's very educational. And you kind of sit there and you go, okay, this is great, right? It's relevant to this new age of kids. We could talk about what Apple's done with the brand, but I think it's going to be pretty big. And, one thing that Eric talks about is how this, this has brought the best creative talent in the industry to WildBrain. And he talks about it kind of, being this cycle where the best talent's coming in WildBrain. It's highlighting the rest of their portfolio IP. And it's really kind of illuminating some of the other brands that could become big again. And it really seems that it's starting to play out.
And that's one of the things that actually made me want to reach out to you about WildBrain, because my wife and I, after enough people told us we needed to watch Ted Lasso, I upgraded my phone and I signed up for the year of Apple Plus. And the first thing when I got Apple TV Plus or whatever, the first thing that popped up was Snoopy in Space, new episodes streaming now, right? And like, I do think people underestimate, like, if something's on the front page of Netflix, that thing's almost going to become a hit because it gets so many eyeballs and enough people just click on it because it's on the front page of Netflix.
No matter how horrible the production is, right? Yes. And in the Snoopy stuff, it's actually pretty good content.
And Apple TV is not, it's not Netflix, unfortunately, right? Like way more people on Netflix, but just bringing a couple extra people in because, hey, it's front page of Apple TV, they click on it, that gets the whole kind of flywheel for the brand growing, right? Because now you've got some kids who are interested in Snoopy in Space. Maybe they're interested in the rest of Peanuts. Maybe they want to go buy some Snoopy things. And that just kind of gets the whole flywheel going. So that's one of the things that really got me interested in this.
Yeah. Well, so, so in terms of what is Apple doing? So, they announced the deal last year, and, Eric Ellenbogen, mentioned that it's the largest content deal in WildBrain's history as a company. And, at first, so you sit there and you go, okay, so Peanuts is going to be part of Apple TV's kid streaming service. And, that's what it had appeared to be a year ago. And I think what has become fairly obvious at this point is it's not just part of Apple's streaming service. It is Apple's anchor property for their entire entry into streaming for kids. And it's one of their entry properties for streaming, period. And, so recently they licensed the back catalog too, right? So all the old content, the old Christmas special, Thanksgiving special. And, Eric mentioned on the last call, but they paid something like 80% more than the last license that was paid by ABC Television when it was part of Iconic's brand. So, Apple put great value on the back catalog, but, in terms of what they're doing going forward, they started with Snoopy in Space in partnership with NASA. And, that was a very well done property. It was one of their most popular shows. Won a couple of awards. It was recently renewed for a season 2. They have another show that they just actually premiered a couple weeks ago. It's called The Snoopy Show, and that's been very successful. They had, at the end of last year, Apple TV had Mariah Carey's Christmas special, and that was #1 on the Apple charts in like 100 different countries over that week. And if you watched it, kind of the first premiere guest experience or guest experience, the guest appearance. And this was before Snoop Dogg and Ariana Grande and all that, was the Peanuts gang. And then, so last week when the Snoopy Show released, if you went to Apple's website that day, the Peanuts crew and Snoopy completely took over Apple's entire website. When you scroll down at the top was like it was like the MacBooks, and the Mac, that picture, it was like Snoopy riding the MacBook like it was his kennel or his doghouse, and then below it was like Woodstock and all of his friends holding up an iPhone, and you go down and it was like Charlie Brown doing something. So completely took over that entire web page. And Apple has ideas to do similar things like that and exhibits in their stores. And like I said, I agree. You can't compare Apple today, at least, to Netflix. But and I don't want to compare Peanuts to Mickey Mouse because there's no comparison, at least at this point. But 120 million people visit Disney theme parks every year. Well, 350 million people visit Apple stores. So it's just, huge potential. It's really exciting to think what can happen. And then, and that's just, Apple, but this is going to feed off everything else. Cedar Fair, all the amusement parks like Knott's Berry Farm, and there's a bunch all over, they license the Peanuts characters, and that's kind of their brand for their amusement parks. But I think all of this, it's going to feed off each other. And this is all obviously led by Apple's, the biggest company in the world, right? In terms of market cap, it's all kind of led by their efforts. And I think it's going to be huge, and most people don't realize this yet. So that's just the Peanuts franchise. And like I said, we could talk about other content, but I think it illuminates the rest of their portfolio. And, Eric Ellenbogen has a, he said a couple of times, the key is content everywhere, right? So they have this, they have Apple there. And then, on Netflix, they have a show called Chip and Potato, which has been very popular. They just did a co-production with DreamWorks on Netflix called Go Dog Go. That's a top 10 kids show on Netflix right now. Johnny Test is one of their properties, and that was just picked up by Netflix for another season. And they licensed the entire back catalog, which I think was maybe with HBO Max. So they obviously paid up to get that. And then they have shows with traditional television, linear television. They have a show called Dorg Van Dago, which is on Nickelodeon right now. They have their own AVOD channels on Roku televisions and on Samsung televisions. And then they have, properties like Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs is with Comcast's Xfinity. And then they just announced the Sonic deal last quarter, which I think is huge in that it got me to maybe look at this company differently than I've ever looked at it before. When I have thought about this company's library of IP, I've really only paid attention to the brands where they're the copyright owner. Mm-hmm. Because usually if you're the copyright owner, you have, you get consumer products and there's more upside. If you're not the copyright owner, it's a service project, and maybe you get paid to produce, similar to like with Go Dog Go, right? The co-production they have with DreamWorks on Netflix. The Sonic announcement changed that all because they are not the copyright owner of Sonic. And I think that this is why I said earlier that I think one of the really important things to understand about its competitive characteristics is that it's a fully vertically integrated company. And because it's fully integrated, they enjoy certain benefits that companies that aren't vertically integrated don't enjoy. So the example here is you have Sega, and Sega owns Sonic. Sonic is one of the most popular video games ever created. They've sold, I think, 1.1 billion game units since 1992. It was a feature film last year starring Jim Carrey. That film did 320 million at the box office. It broke a record in that it is now the highest grossing movie ever based on a video game character. But because of the vertical integration, like I said, WildBrain's not the copyright owner, but they own the distribution rights to the past shows, which I think right now are being distributed through HBO Max. But they also represent the brand with their licensing agency, WildBrain CPLG. So they represent the Sonic brand throughout continental Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa, and I think other parts of the world too. But so Sega's a video game company. They're not a studio. They don't make movies, TV shows. They don't have an animation division. So, if Sega wants to do something with that brand, they need a partner. They can't do it on their own. And because WildBrain has been so intimately involved with that brand as a licensing agent and as the distribution entity, they were able to basically sign a deal with Sega where they're producing this new content for Netflix. It's going to be on Netflix. It's called Sonic Boom. But they have negotiated terms with Sega where this isn't a service project. They're a true partner where they have a stake in production, a stake in distribution, and a stake in consumer products. So from that standpoint, in terms of the economics, this Sonic film is no different than the Peanuts franchise, right? The Peanuts franchise, they own 41% of the Peanuts franchise. They get 41% of the consumer products royalties. Well, I don't know the exact terms of the Sonic thing, but let's say it's 50%. Well, I mean, if they're getting 50% of the consumer products on Sonic, provided that the Peanuts shows and the Sonic shows are equally popular, they actually have, they'll actually make more money with Sonic. So like I said, it's that vertically integrated nature that allows them to have these economics with non-copyright IP. And so, like I said, I never really thought about it that way. So I never looked at Sonic as part of their library, but what that forced me to do is, what else do they have in their library where they're either distribution manager, where they represent the brand on an AVOD basis, or where they represent it in consumer products licensing. Well, that grows the library of IP to something that's absolutely incredible. It's like, so from a distribution standpoint, they represent Super Mario. Well, if Nintendo wants to make new content, Nintendo can't do it. They're a video game company. Maybe WildBrain could negotiate rights there. With Sony, they handle the AVOD distribution and the AVOD channel management, distribution rights, and consumer products licensing for Ghostbusters. Well, Sony's a media company, but Sony doesn't have an animation division, so they would need someone like WildBrain. And the list is big. I mean, Pink Panther, which was a big brand once upon a time. Imagine if that became a big brand again. And it's just Curious George, and it goes on and on and on and on. And it just, really opens your eyes as to, this is bigger than just their copyright ownership of IP. It expands to their entire portfolio, provided that they're the chosen partner.
Let me switch dramatically and let's talk about WildBrain Spark, because I think you mentioned when you were pitching, when we were opening up the company, hey, if you look at the multiples for streaming services right now, WildBrain Spark could be worth the whole company. And it's one of the things when I've looked at this, I've had trouble because I can see both sides, right? Like why don't you describe WildBrain Spark, and then I'll kind of go through my hesitations on it.
Yeah, well, so I know off the bat, one of your hesitations was my original hesitation, and it's like, well, Netflix is the distribution, right? Apple TV is the distribution. Is WildBrain really the distribution, or is YouTube the distribution? So, that was one of, can YouTube tomorrow turn around and say, we don't want to work with WildBrain? And, so that was something that I had to get past. But anyway, so WildBrain Spark. So, go back 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when AVOD started becoming, looked like it was, part of the future of kids content. WildBrain took their basically their library of IP for their own brands and threw it up on YouTube, and had a lot of success doing that, and started working with, third-party brands, and it's just grown and grown and grown, to the point where, today, they have about 800 different channels on YouTube. They represent more than just their own brands. They represent about 650 different brands. Collectively, they have 200 million subscribers. Like I said, 4 billion minutes of watch time every month. They claim to reach 1 in 3 kids globally. So, 40% of kids globally watch content every month on the WildBrain network. And, they've invested a lot in ad tech and a direct sales team. And the business was really, taken off. I want to say it grew from, like it was doing 5 million in revenue in 2015, let's say, and by 2018 it was doing 80 million in revenue. So you had huge growth, and then you had a combination of two things that really decimated that business, and it was temporary. But you had COVID, so you had to pull back on. A lot of advertisers stopped spending the advertising dollars, but you also, and I'm sure you've heard of this, made for kids content. So basically the whole thing with YouTube is that it's no longer contextual advertising like linear broadcast television. It's targeted advertising, where you could target the individuals watching your content, and you could gather data on those unique individuals, such as you and me. And the FCC came out and basically told YouTube that you can no longer target minors. So to advertise to minors, it needs to be done contextually, similar to the way that linear broadcast television is done.
Yep.
And YouTube's advertising placement, none of it is like an ad sales team. It's all based on an algorithm. And if you Andrew Walker want to put an ad for your podcast on YouTube, you could specify certain parameters for your ad, but you really have very little control over where it gets placed. And so anyways, because you couldn't target, and a big part of their algorithm, it's all based on that targeting data, and because you couldn't do that anymore, it kind of just threw a wrench into their YouTube algorithm, and you saw revenue from WildBrain Spark fall off a cliff. But it was somewhat of a blessing in disguise in that it forced YouTube now to only start catering to advertisers that are COPPA compliant. And when you think of people uploading content on YouTube, it's so there's millions of people uploading content that really, for a kids format now, in order for YouTube to sponsor it, it has to be contributors that have great scale. And there's not many that have scale like WildBrian does. Like I said, they're either the first or second largest network of content on WildBrain, and it's also enabled them to build out their own sales team. So now they're not just sitting here relying on YouTube's algorithm. YouTube is fixing that algorithm, because that's big business. I mean, if on Google's last conference call, I want to say maybe 15% of the revenue was from YouTube, and kids is either, I think it's the second or third largest genre on YouTube. So that's a big piece of YouTube revenue. So they're fixing their algorithm, but like I said, it's enabled WildBrain. They've spent a lot of money doing it, but building out their own sales team, and they have a great proposition for advertisers. I mean, if you just want to compare YouTube to the cable networks, for example, and if you look at viewers per month, so WildBrain Spark on their network, their viewers per month is basically double Cartoon Network, double PBS Kids, and double Nickelodeon. The only cable network that has higher viewership and watch time and engagement than WildBrain Spark would be Disney. So they have a great sales pitch to advertisers. And also you've seen advertising dollars shift from linear to nonlinear. And so the global kids advertising market's about $4.7 billion. So that's the total addressable market. Well, in 2012, 9% of those advertising dollars went to nonlinear. Well, today it's about 40%, and it's growing. So, so of that 4.7 billion, roughly 2 billion is now being spent on nonlinear, and YouTube in terms of kids content is the 800-pound gorilla, and WildBrain Sparks network is a big part of that.
So let me push back a little harder on this, because as you said, there were both attractive and unattractive things that said here. So I think you even said it when your first pushback, and the thing you had to get over was, hey, this is not Netflix, right? This is a YouTube channel, and it's a whole bunch of YouTube channels that are very widely watched, but YouTube is the distributor here, right? So when I hear that, I do kind of think obviously, they got hit by YouTube by not being able to target minors anymore. But at some point, if YouTube really got pissed off at them or something, YouTube could change the algorithm, so people are just pushed away from WildBrain's things. Or I also think hey, a legacy cable channel right now they face all sorts of other issues, but a legacy cable channel trades for 6 or 7 times EBITDA, whereas a Netflix trades for 20 times sales or something, right? So why, when I am looking at this at WildBrain Sparks, why am I not thinking more legacy cable channel, obviously with different dynamics, but why is it worth more than legacy cable channel? Why is the brand and the moat better than that? Why is it more on the kind of Netflix side than that?
Yeah. Well, so I think for one thing, if you look at some of the third-party brands that have engaged Spark, I mean, brands like Paw Patrol, right? Paw Patrol, Nickelodeon handles their linear broadcast efforts. Well, they've partnered with WildBrain Spark to represent their entire AVOD push, and there's other big brands that have done that as well. So, I understand where you're coming from, but I would just say, Eric talks a lot about how, he's been doing this for a long time, and 100% of the time in his career, ad dollars follow eyeballs, and it's that simple. And if that watch time, continues like it has been, and they are one of the largest beneficiaries today, at least, of eyeballs in this nonlinear world, ad dollars are going to follow. And like I said, you had that hiccup, but it appears that from the COPA compliance stuff, but it appears that business segment's rebounded. Revenue grew 70% sequentially from last quarter. So I think this past quarter they did like 16 million in revenue. And the company believes strongly that they have a large and a long runway, for growth, and not just in, with traditional advertising. So by the way, with what they're doing right now with the direct sales advertising team, they're able to charge much higher CPMs than what would be typically assigned to the YouTube algorithm. And I think on this last conference call, Eric even mentioned in answering one of the analyst questions that, YouTube, when they place an ad, the split's 50-50. 50% goes to YouTube, 50% goes to the creator. But with this direct sales effort, I think it's, YouTube still gets their take, but a lot of the incremental margin goes to WildBrain. But, also where they've seen big growth, it's not just from advertising, it's from content production. So, one of the big things they're doing now are these toy unboxing videos. So, yeah, I mean, it's pretty crazy what kids watch today, but, kids will watch, a kid unwrapping a Snoopy toy and being all excited and jumping up and down. Well, that's not considered a commercial. That's content that they're producing for that brand, which makes the slice of, at least the pie that WildBrain Spark could gather, that much bigger. So I don't know if that, fully answers your question, but what I can tell you is the company's been talking a lot about how they've been spending a lot of money on ad tech, and they've been spending a lot of money on their sales team, building that, because everything that they've seen, suggests that this is a huge growth area for them. And then, I would also mention that that's just for advertising sales. And, advertising sales, if you figure over the next year, if they do what they did last quarter, the opportunity is about 60 million. I think just advertising sales could grow to, 200-300 million. But, potentially where WildBrain Spark is even more exciting is their ability to discover tomorrow's hits. And, they've talked a lot about that. And, I've told you, right, a doll brand is big amongst 12-year-olds in France, and you could take it to the rest of the world and help them grow that presence. And if you look at what they've done for some of these brands, it's pretty amazing. So, just as one example, so Sunny Bunnies is a Russian kids property. And now this is going back several years ago. So I think that they were trying to prove the concept several years ago. Today, it'd be different, right? They'd have economics in the brand, they participate in consumer products. But, so Sunny Bunnies had a season 1 in Russia on the Disney Channel in Russia. And after their season 1, their YouTube channel had 1,200 subscribers. So they went to WildBrain Spark to help them. They hired them as their channel manager to help them grow their AVOD presence. And WildBrain grew that channel from 1,200 subscribers to, I think it was like 400,000 subscribers and 2 billion views. And that success, helped that brand grow, helped them secure a master toy partner. And I think last year that brand was ultimately bought by Disney. But, WildBrain Spark was the one responsible for kind of putting that brand on the map. So, if you go look at the brands they're dealing with now at Spark, like I said, they're handling the channel management for brands like Paw Patrol, which, clearly with a brand like that, they're just brand manager. Paw Patrol doesn't need their help. But there's a brand called Spookiz, which is a South Korean owned property by a company called Keyring Studios, and they hired WildBrain for their channel management. And WildBrain just created a full length film on YouTube, and it's like the #1 watched movie on YouTube of all time, and so. They've helped discover a lot of brands, and they're taking economics in some of these brands. So, I think that'll come to fruition. So,
yeah. And again, it goes back to the Netflix home screen thing that I love. Like, and it's one of the things I'm trying to debate. And it seems like you follow on the distribution side, but the person who owns the distribution, if WildBrain does that with their channel ownership and everything, like they can see, as you said, oh, this is getting interesting in South Korea. So let's get some economics. Let's roll this out worldwide. If it's a hit, we're going to make 20, 30, 50 times our money. We're going to build this huge international brand. And I just love having that distribution to do that. We're coming up on the end. So I just want to kind of wrap all my devil's advocate into one last thing. So, when I look at the stock market, like I look at something like a company I've thought a lot about, Lionsgate, right? I don't know if you know it or not, but Lionsgate they own Stars, the pay video channel that most people know, right behind HBO. They own Stars, and then they own Lionsgate, which is the movie studio and the TV production company. They made Hunger Games, they made Twilight, they made Mad Men. So they've got a big movie and TV production studio with lots of rights there. And I look at that and I say, hey, the enterprise value there is about $5 billion. CBS offered to buy Stars from Lionsgate for about $5 billion, maybe 18 months, 2 years ago, right? So obviously things have changed a little bit, but I think when you look at it, you could say, hey, the market is valuing Stars. The market is valuing Lionsgate for Stars, and it's basically putting a 0 on the TV and film production studio and all that sort of stuff. And there are management issues. There's a lot of other things there. But, I look at something like MGM, which owns James Bond, Rocky, a bunch of other classic films. They're for sale, and it doesn't seem like people are beating down their door, right? So when I look at WildBrain, I do wonder, hey, the market just doesn't seem to care, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of demand for people to kind of go out and buy it. It seems to be much more people, they're willing to license, they're willing to take your shows, but they really want to build a lot of this stuff, right? Does that make sense? Is that a concern for you at all? Because when I look at WildBrain, I say, hey, if Apple's rolling out so much of Peanuts, Apple buying WildBrain to get full control of Peanuts makes all the sense in the world long term, but it doesn't seem like that's where the market's going. It doesn't seem like that's the direction.
Yeah, so it's funny, to go back to that 2015 pitch by Fine Capital at the Sohn conference. I think, now they were obviously early, very early, but they've bought down and really lowered their cost basis. So this will be a great investment for them. But one of the things that I think they hit right on was that kids content, particularly animated content, is different than all other content.
Yep.
In live action, it's kind of like you have your movie, you get money up front from the content production, but then, and maybe there's a revenue drip for in perpetuity, but not really. It's kind of like you start all over and you go back to the drawing board, unless you have a truly great movie or franchise that is timeless. So like Miracle on 34th Street, every Christmas people are going to watch that. You mentioned MGM, the Rocky franchise, the Rambo, a couple of franchises like that. I think those are timeless. People are going to watch those again and again and again. But for the most part, live action is just very different than animation. And it's really hard to build a timeless franchise. With kids content, it's a little different. And I think because new generations are always popping up. So new generations of kids will watch the same. It's like my kids right now on Cartoon Network, my younger son loves Scooby-Doo. Well, those are the same Scooby-Doo episodes. It's not new animation. Those are the same ones I watched years ago. Because it's animated, it's much easier to, take into different languages and across different territories. And the most important part and this is what's tough about live action, unless it's supernatural or like mystery, like a Harry Potter, live action just doesn't really lend itself to consumer products like animated content does. So, I think that's pretty huge. We've talked about the Peanuts franchise. The one thing we didn't talk about though was, the ability to do this with other library IP. So this is where, like I said earlier, I think the Peanuts franchise today is worth roughly the enterprise value. I think it'll be worth much more as Apple fully rolls out and develops this content and makes the brand significant again. But in terms of the other portfolio IP, like Strawberry Shortcake and Teletubbies, now that's where potentially this becomes a home run investment, but that's based on management execution. And will management execute? I think they will. But just to give you, one example of the potential here. So, Strawberry Shortcake, which management's pretty excited about, and I am too. There's been no new content created for Strawberry Shortcake in decades. In the early 90s, Strawberry Shortcake was created as a 1-hour film for 20th Century Fox with an investment of $250,000. Over the next 4 years, Strawberry Shortcake did $5 billion in consumer product sales. I mean, $5 billion in consumer product sales, it does nothing today. In Eric Ellenbogen's first conference call as the new CEO, he was talking about their portfolio of IP, and he talked about how one of the things that really shocked him when he came in is if you look at Teletubbies, he said in the prior calendar year, Teletubbies had done less than $1 million in consumer product sales. This was a brand that was doing $200-300 million a year in consumer product sales in the early 2000s. So that right there, and like I said, with those brands, it's based on execution. I think Peanuts is kind of already there. With execution, I think consumer product sales could grow significantly. But I think that right there, high margin consumer product sales, is really one of the main differentiators from live action and kids animated content.
When you think of, so Strawberry Shortcake and Teletubbies, I'm just trying to think, and I'm positive there are examples of this, but are there brands that, did hundreds of millions of sales in the 90s, 80s, whenever you want to call it, lied dormant for 10, 15, 20 years, and then had a relaunch, a successful relaunch? And I'm talking kids brands specifically. Can you think of any?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I haven't studied other content types enough to know that. Maybe Scooby-Doo. If you remember, Scooby-Doo had that movie with Matthew Lillard. And
yeah. And I think like Alvin and the Chipmunks has had a bunch of relaunch movies. The Trolls movies, which I really enjoyed the first Trolls movie that DreamWorks put out. Obviously, that resets it. Smurfs had to come back. I was just trying to think of like consumer focused products, but I'm sure there are plenty. And look, nostalgia plays right now, right? So I would not be surprised if there's just a nostalgia angle.
Well, I'll tell you what I find, one of the things that I find interesting, and I don't really know this, right? Because I've never launched a consumer products strategy for a kids brand. Eric's been there for 6 quarters now. And when he first got there, he talked about, the upcoming toy launch, for the Strawberry Shortcake franchise. Well, I mean, here we are six quarters later, and there's been no toy launch. They haven't even really created the new IP that they've been developing. And I just think, when he talks about it, he's like, we test the hell out of this. We test the hell out of it, focus groups, and I mean, when you look at what past WildBrain did with some of the past relaunches of brands like Teletubbies and stuff like that, I think there is an expertise involved with creating franchises, and like Eric always says, you need to lead with lead with the content, chase with consumer products. And I think he's developed an ability to do that and be successful doing that. And this is kind of unrelated, but I put this sheet of paper in front of me because I think this is very important. This is from their summary consolidated financial statements from a couple of quarters ago for their fiscal 2020. But one of the biggest changes under Eric has been to focus on what he thinks could be their great franchises. And he's really brought a mentality of quality over quantity, where I think past management was just focused on putting stuff out there. And I think most companies are focused on putting stuff out there. So, I mean, so this is, pretty crazy. He's been there for 6 quarters now. So he was there for partial fiscal 19 and all of fiscal 20. So if you look at proprietary half hours of content delivered, plus third-party titles with distribution rights, half hours added to the library. So in fiscal 2018, they had 228 half hours. In fiscal 2019, they had 168 half hours. In fiscal 2020, it was 74 half hours. So he's gone from 228. So under prior management, 228 half hours of content delivered or produced. And Eric Ellenbogen this past fiscal year did 74. So 228 to 74. Yet if you look at the company revenue is basically flat over the last 3 years. So I mean that, I think that right there is very, very telling.
Yep.
And they're looking for great deals, great content deals. And if they don't get that great content deal, guess what? They're going to go build the brand on AVOD Spark. And that's what they're doing with Strawberry Shortcake. And they'll continue to build that brand on WildBrain Spark, their AVOD network, until a Netflix or someone comes along with some great deal where the economics make a lot of sense and they're able to make a lot of money on it.
We're kind of well over an hour, but I've really enjoyed this. Let me wrap this up with, not in a Super Bowl case where, WildBrain Spark becomes the next Netflix and Peanuts is, the most valuable franchise on earth. But when you run a reasonable bull case, and we look forward 3 years from now, right? Like they do have a lot of convertible debt, if I remember correctly. There's a lot of stuff out there, but what are you kind of playing for here, right? If I remember, I don't have my screen up, but I think the share price is about $3 per share Canadian right now. What are you playing for in 3 to 5 years, do you think?
Well, so first, one thing that I think is really interesting is, and you're right, they do have a lot of debt. On this last conference call, the CFO, Aaron Ames, and he's been, very conservative in past guidance. And he did make a remark that basically starting now, that debt will no longer so much be serviced with existing cash flow, but they are going to start significantly reducing the leverage or the leverage through EBITDA growth. And right now, I think they're like at 5.5 times is their debt leverage. And he said that they feel very comfortable that by the end of this fiscal year, they'll be in the mid 4s. So, I think that tells you something about what they see around the corner. And then I think if you just take their existing library and some of the pieces of IP that they've identified, obviously Peanuts, Strawberry Shortcake, Teletubbies, In the Night Garden, Inspector Gadget, and it's kind of a big range, but, assuming that each of these brands, dependent on the deal could, add something, let's say between 5 to 10 million EBITDA per property. And what enables them to do that once again is their distribution, owning their own distribution. They could build these brands until they get the right deal. But if you just, add that EBITDA margin from those different properties, plus the revenue growth in advertising at WildBrain Spark, and, I've told you, I think they could get to, 200-300 million. I think that Eric Ellenbogen very easily hits his top incentive target, which is $11 per share. So we will own this, and I don't plan on selling any shares until it hits that $11 price target. And I would argue that by then we're going to know a lot more. So by then we're going to know a lot more about what this company's future looks like. And they just announced the Sonic deal. And by the way, I didn't even mention Sonic, right?
It didn't even have time.
Sonic's something that could be a lot bigger than, I at least from the conference call, they seem to hint that this is of the type of caliber deal that Peanuts is. And then he mentioned, stay tuned for many more, new announcements like that, which makes you think about the rest of their library. One that we didn't mention at all is they just finished a script for the Green Hornet. So, they negotiated once again with the copyright owner of the Green Hornet they're going to produce new children's content, and they did this with Kevin Smith, who I guess wrote the pilot. But now they're going to shop that around to some of the big SVOD services. But the Green Hornet's another one that really lends itself to consumer product sales. So I'm not even, when I think about where this company's headed, I'm not even really thinking about consumer product sales for any of the brands outside of Peanuts, which I think could be sizable for sure with Sonic, but hopefully with Strawberry Shortcake and Green Hornet and some of these. But like I said, by the time this stock is $11, I would expect us to have a lot more clarity on the EBITDA contribution from something like a Sonic, from something like a Peanuts. They've said, in past calls that they don't really expect, the meat of these deals to start hitting the financials until fiscal 2022. Well, right now we're they just reported Q2 fiscal 2021.
And that's the great thing. Like by the time in your case where it hits 11, like they've hit that flywheel where, hey, we've proven we can take the Sonic and take it to the next level through our distribution. And WildBrain Spark is in another 200 million kids are watching it. So a lot more people are coming to us and saying, hey, can we have the Sonic deal? Because we know it's going to be even bigger because your distribution is even bigger and better. And you've proven it out. And you almost get that flywheel going in that sense.
Yeah. I mean, and you talk a lot about the flywheel. I feel like that's, you should copyright that word, flywheel. I hear you.
I wish it's smarter people than me came up with that.
No, but 100%, right? So I have no doubt that this Sonic deal came about because of what they have shown with the Apple Peanuts.
Mm-hmm.
If now the content has to be good, but if the content's been good and they've demonstrated the ability to make great content with the new Apple, Peanuts content.
Yep.
That'll lend itself to consumer product sales, and other brands are going to see what they did with the Sonic franchise. And then, so yes, when Nintendo wants to make new animated content for Super Mario Brothers, who's their partner going to be? It's not going to be Disney. Disney's, they're too big. They're doing their own things. There's not a lot of games in town, right? And if it's WildBrain, and WildBrain has demonstrated the ability to do what they have. And by the way, I mentioned Super Mario just because the back episodes are part of WildBrain's distribution catalog.
Comcast is making the Super Mario movie for 2022 though, right? So
yeah, well, so what's interesting, so the movie's different, right? So like Paramount made the
Sonic movie, so maybe the TV and the movies are done differently.
Yeah, well, so what's different is it's my understanding that consumer rights that were tied to the Sonic movie, that's owned by Sega. So once again, it's all that's kind of what's hard with media too. Every deal is different, right?
Yep. Every
deal is different. No deal is the same. And as investors, you're kind of in the dark as to the specifics of the deal, because like with the Peanuts thing, Apple doesn't want WildBrain, disclosing, maybe, certain economics, because they don't want to give those same economics, to people that they're dealing with. So, like I said, and one of the hard things with media is so much of it is based on your belief in management executing.
Mm-hmm.
But that's one of the reasons why I feel comfortable with this position at these prices, is because, like I said, from a downside perspective, I feel like so much of it is just in, the Peanuts franchise. And I would expect, as this stock starts to run, you're going to have more clarity with a lot of the other things, like, like Sonic, like Strawberry Shortcake. You'll have other deals announced, which in theory should help you have a moving price, target. So, I say $11, but who knows? Maybe when it hits 11, I'll feel comfortable with a $20 stock. And a lot of that is like I said, it's really all based on execution. But the one thing that's for sure is their portfolio of IP has done it before. Reinventing it's not going to be easy, but I would argue that something that was great once at least has the workings to potentially be great again in the right hands.
Perfect. Well, hey, I think we're going to wrap it up there if that's okay with you. We're way over time, but this is an interesting one, and I'm excited we went as in depth as we did. Joe Boskovich, thanks so much for coming on the pod, and we might have to do. Oh, he's saying one more second. What's going on?
One more thing. So, there was a really interesting comment on one of the analysts asked, and this was a question that I had a long time ago too, but you're having this great success on YouTube. Have you thought about, launching your own AVOD network where you're the distribution arm?
I highlighted that line when I was reading the transcript. Absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
And, it's so Eric answered that question with saying, right now, all the eyeballs are on YouTube. So that, this is an area for us to attack and attack hard. They've diversified beyond YouTube where they're, on several of the other AVOD platforms. But then, if you go, if you buy a Roku, WildBrain, they have their own channel on Roku TV. If you buy a Samsung channel, they have their own AVOD channel on Samsung TVs. So I think that they're dabbling in that somewhat. But it's one thing to launch your own distribution service, but it's another thing to have the eyeballs, right? So it's like, you could have your own app, but if the only users of the app are you, your mom, and your girlfriend, you're never going to make any money, right? So I think you see the wheels turning, you see them kind of dipping their foot in their water in terms of other distribution, but the eyeballs are with YouTube. And from, what the company says, the company, talks about how YouTube is a great partner and a partner where they have a great relationship with, and particularly in this COPPA compliant world where you can't target kids,
Mm-hmm.
The WildBrain Spark network is a network that's important to YouTube. And so I would argue, as long as you could be a great partner with YouTube and YouTube values you as a partner, and you value YouTube as a partner, that seems like a silly recipe to mess with. So.
Well, let's leave it there. Joe,
Yeah.
This has been great. We'll have to have you on to talk maybe an IDT spin or some uranium at some point. But look, the conversation on WildBrian has been great, and you took it into a lot of different places. So thanks again for coming on.
Thank you. I appreciate it, man.
Perfect, man.